A lone, mournful train whistle pierces the thick, gray fog of a fractured America, signaling the end of the bloodiest conflict in the nation's history. Abraham Lincoln is dead, and with him dies the political certainty of the era, leaving a vacuum of power that politicians are too weak to fill. The Civil War has left the South in ruins and the North seeking direction, but chaos is merely a ladder for a new breed of predator. While the world views American democracy as a failed experiment, a shadow government of industrialists is quietly drafting the blueprints for a global superpower. From the ashes of battle, the entrepreneur emerges not as a merchant, but as a conqueror, ready to carve the country into personal fiefdoms of steel and steam. Cornelius Vanderbilt stands atop this new hierarchy, the old lion who has spent a lifetime dominating the seas, now turning his hungry gaze toward the land. He is a man of brute force and physical imposition, believing that infrastructure is not a public service, but a weapon to be wielded against lesser men. At an age when most men retreat to the fireplace, Vanderbilt makes a terrifying pivot, selling his entire shipping fleet to bet everything on the railroads. This is the first lesson of the Titan. True vision requires the ruthless courage to kill the very business that made you rich to survive the future. He sees what others miss. The disconnected patchwork of rails across America is not a system, but an inefficiency waiting to be consolidated into an empire. Vanderbilt understands that in a disorganized world, the man who controls the logistics controls the economy, a philosophy that predates the modern supply chain by a century. But even lions bleed, and the loss of his favorite son, George, in the war leaves a gaping wound in the Commodore's armor, exposing his emotional vulnerability. He looks at his surviving son, William, and sees only softness, a devastating judgment for a father who equates love with competence and strength with survival. The sharks of Wall Street smell this blood in the water, mistaking the Commodore's grief for senility, believing the old king is finally ready to fall. They underestimate the rage of a grieving father, for Vanderbilt decides that if he cannot find peace, he will enforce submission upon the entire market. The rival railroads believe they can bypass him, unaware that they are playing checkers against a man who is rewriting the rules of three-dimensional chess. Vanderbilt controls the Albany Bridge, the solitary gateway into New York City, the beating heart of American commerce, and the continent's largest port. In a move of strategic brilliance, he orders the bridge closed, physically severing New York from the rest of the country in a terrifying display of leverage. Consider the modern parallel. This was the 19th century equivalent of a tech giant deplatforming a competitor, shutting off the server access that sustains their life. Without the bridge, millions of dollars in cargo rot in the sun, and the supply chain of the entire Northeast freezes instantly at Vanderbilt's command. The blockade is an act of war, proving that in the game of giants, physical infrastructure is the ultimate trump card against theoretical wealth. His competitors watch in horror as their stock prices plummet, their liquidity evaporating as the market realizes they have no access to the customer. Panic sweeps through Wall Street, a frenzy of selling that drives the value of rival railroads into the dirt, exactly as the Commodore had calculated. This train goes no further, his agents declare, a sentence that rings like a death knell for the independent operators who dared to challenge his supremacy. While others scream in the trading pits, Vanderbilt sits in silence, waiting for the price to hit rock bottom before he makes his move. He buys the worthless stock of his rivals for pennies, absorbing their infrastructure into his own growing leviathan, the New York Central Railroad. In days, he transforms from a competitor into a monopoly, proving that the most efficient way to beat the competition is to simply buy them out. The consolidation of the railways creates a unified network, reducing travel times and costs, effectively shrinking the American continent through sheer efficiency. To consecrate his victory, he commissions the Grand Central Depot, a cathedral of industry designed to make the common man feel small in the presence of his power. It stands as the largest building in New York, a physical manifestation of the ego required to build a nation, casting a long shadow over the city. Yet, heavy lies the crown, for as Vanderbilt surveys his dominion, he realizes that a railroad is a hungry beast that must constantly be fed cargo. The tracks are laid, the competitors are crushed, but the infinite growth required by capitalism demands a new source of fuel to keep the engine running. He has conquered the where, but now he faces the what, searching for the next commodity that will define the American century. Blind ambition often breeds hubris, and Vanderbilt, drunk on his own invincibility, believes he can bully the market into providing him with a solution. But the world is changing faster than even he can perceive, and the next threat will not come from a rival king, but from the shadows. Somewhere in the gritty, oil-soaked fields of Ohio, a different kind of leader is emerging, one who does not seek to conquer, but to purify. While Vanderbilt plays the game of war, this new figure is playing a game of divinity, believing his rise is not just business, but fate. The Commodore looks for new lands to conquer, unaware that the ground beneath him is shifting, and the age of the railroad is peaking. In the pursuit of absolute power, are you the driver of the machine? Or are you merely preparing the tracks for the man who will replace you? Vanderbilt turns his eyes toward the Erie Railroad, the one line that still eludes his grasp, driven by a compulsive need to own it all. He prepares a hostile takeover, the standard playbook of a man who has never encountered a problem that money and intimidation couldn't solve. But in the boardrooms of the Erie, two young wolves, Jay Gould and Jim Fisk, are waiting with a scheme that defies the logic of the old world. They represent the chaotic energy of the next generation, men who view the stock market not as a ledger of value, but as a casino. As Vanderbilt buys Erie stock to gain control, Gould and Fisk begin printing new shares in the basement, diluting the pool faster than Vanderbilt can buy. It is a technique known as watering the stock, a fraudulent magic trick that turns the Commodore's millions into worthless paper in real time. The old lion roars, pouring more money into the pit, unable to comprehend that his opponents are not playing by the rules of honor or physics. He is fighting a digital war with analog weapons, outmaneuvered by men who understand that perception can be manipulated more easily than reality. The realization of defeat is slow and painful. Vanderbilt has lost millions to two men who mock him from the safety of a Jersey hotel room. Publicly humiliated, the Commodore retreats, a rare moment of weakness that signals to the world that the king is not invincible. It is no secret what he tried to do, the press declares, celebrating the underdog victory of Gould and Fisk, unaware of the monster they have poked. Vanderbilt, stinging from the loss, realizes that the era of chaotic expansion is over. He must find stability, he must find a partner he can control. He needs a guarantee, a steady stream of freight that will fill his trains regardless of the economic weather or the schemes of Wall Street speculators. His advisors whisper of a new substance bubbling up from the ground in Pennsylvania, a black sludge that promises to turn night into day. Kerosene is the disruptive technology of the age, granting the average American the power to push back the darkness, altering the rhythm of human life. Vanderbilt sees the math immediately. Light is not a luxury, it is a necessity. And whoever controls the transport of oil controls the light. He looks to Cleveland, a boom town sitting on a sea of crude, seeking a refiner hungry enough to accept his terms and capable enough to deliver. Enter John D. Rockefeller, a young man of 27, teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, but possessed of a terrifyingly calm demeanor. Rockefeller is the cold specter, a man who walks through the chaotic oil fields like a priest in a brothel, judging the waste and disorder. To him, the oil industry is a sinful mess of gamblers and wildcatters. He seeks to bring the discipline of the ledger to the chaos of the earth. When the summons comes from Vanderbilt, Rockefeller does not see it as a lifeline, but as a confirmation of the destiny he has prayed for. He prepares to travel to New York, not as a beggar, but as an equal, despite his empty pockets and the precarious state of his refinery. But fate, or perhaps the God he speaks to so intimately, intervenes with a lesson that will calcify his soul forever. Rockefeller misses the morning train, a trivial mistake that becomes a moment of divine terror when the train derails and plunges into a ravine. He stands at the station, reading the news of the twisted metal and the dead, realizing that he was spared for a specific, monumental purpose. This is the pivot. The moment a businessman dies and a messiah of industry is born, convinced that he is protected by a higher power. He arrives in New York with a newfound gravity, walking into the lion's den of Vanderbilt's office with the silence of a man who cannot be killed. The meeting is a clash of eras. The rough-hewn brawler of the seas versus the ascetic accountant of the new industrial age. Vanderbilt attempts to intimidate, treating the young refiner as just another supplier, to be squeezed for profit and discarded. "I'm looking to do a deal with an oil refinery," Vanderbilt growls, "and that could be you, if you know your place." Rockefeller, unblinkingly, counters with a proposal that sounds like madness. He demands a massive discount on shipping rates in exchange for volume. He promises to fill Vanderbilt's trains with 60 carloads of oil every single day, a volume that exceeds the entire output of his current refinery. It is a lie, a bluff of staggering proportions, but Rockefeller delivers it with the conviction of a prophecy, and Vanderbilt buys it. The deal is struck. Cheap rates for guaranteed volume, a symbiotic pact that will allow Rockefeller to crush his local competitors in Cleveland. But as Rockefeller leaves, the weight of his promise settles in. He has sold oil he does not have, using infrastructure he does not own. He returns to Ohio not to celebrate, but to execute, knowing that failure now would be a sin against the opportunity he was given. The prompt for the modern entrepreneur is clear. Do you have the audacity to sell the future before you have built it, trusting that you can catch up to your own lies? Rockefeller's need for capital to expand leads him to rebrand his chaos into a symbol of trust, naming his company Standard Oil. The name is a promise to the consumer. In a world of exploding lamps and dangerous swill, this product is the standard of safety and quality. Investors flock to the stability of the brand, providing the war chest Rockefeller needs to acquire the capacity he promised Vanderbilt. He moves through Cleveland like a scythe, buying out neighbors, increasing efficiency, and ruthlessly cutting waste to meet the Commodore's quota. Standard Oil becomes the largest shipper of kerosene in the country, and Vanderbilt's trains run full, a profitable alliance of iron and oil. But a monopoly is a hungry thing, and Rockefeller's ambition soon outgrows the capacity of the very man who helped him rise. He is shipping so much oil that Vanderbilt can no longer handle the volume alone, giving Rockefeller the leverage to negotiate with rivals. The cold specter realizes that he is no longer the beggar at the table. He is the chef, and the railroads are merely the waiters serving his feast. Tom Scott of the Pennsylvania Railroad, Vanderbilt's bitter rival, approaches Rockefeller with a better deal, eager to steal the oil traffic. Rockefeller, loyal only to the ledger and his God, plays the titans against each other, securing rebates that make his costs lower than anyone else's. He has achieved the impossible. The customer has become more powerful than the platform, dictating terms to the owners of the infrastructure. Vanderbilt and Scott, realizing they have created a monster, decide to form an unholy alliance, a cartel to crush the refiner they empowered. They agree to hike shipping rates universally, a collusive strike intended to bring Rockefeller to his knees and reclaim their dominance. It is a declaration of war, the old guard uniting to strangle the upstart who dared to become indispensable. Rockefeller receives the news not with anger, but with the icy resolve of a man who has anticipated the betrayal. "It is an act of war," he whispers, "and if they want to fight with iron, I will fight with the earth itself. He looks at the map, tracing the lines between the oil fields and the refineries, seeing a solution that requires no wheels and no tracks. The railroads believe they own the distance between points A and B, but Rockefeller is about to prove that distance is just an engineering problem. Total 5 parts. Starting part, 2/5. Par 2/5. Block 1. Script. The Railroad Alliance, forged in desperation between Vanderbilt and Scott, stands as a monolith of the old world, confident that they hold the keys to the kingdom. They present Rockefeller with an ultimatum: pay the higher rates or leave your oil to rot in the sun, believing he has no other option. It is the classic mistake of the incumbent monopoly, assuming that because you control the current infrastructure, you control the future of innovation. Rockefeller returns to Cleveland, not to surrender, but to engineer a bypass surgery on the American economy that will leave the railroads obsolete. He observes the small pipes used to move oil within the refinery and asks the dangerous question: why can't we just make the pipe longer? This is the birth of the pipeline, a radical concept that threatens to decouple the transport of energy from the wheels of the train. Construction begins in secret, a desperate gamble requiring men to blast through bedrock and lay iron arteries across the wilderness of Pennsylvania. It is a logistical nightmare and a financial black hole, but Rockefeller drives his men with the fervor of a pharaoh building a pyramid. Consider the modern parallel. This is the moment Netflix decided to stream video over the internet, rendering the physical infrastructure of Blockbuster irrelevant overnight. As the final section is welded shut, the oil begins to flow silently beneath the earth, invisible to the arrogance of the railroad tycoons. The result is immediate and catastrophic for the railroads. The cargo that sustained their inflated stock prices simply vanishes from the tracks. Vanderbilt and Scott watch in horror as their trains run empty, the old lion realizing too late that he has been outflanked by a ghost. The loss of oil revenue exposes the fraudulent bubble of the railroad industry, which had been overbuilt on speculation and easy credit. When the market realizes the trains are empty, the panic is instantaneous, triggering a sell-off that shatters the foundation of the U.S. economy. The Panic of 1873 begins, the first true Great Depression of the Industrial Age, a financial hurricane born from the war between two men. Wall Street closes its doors for 10 days, the silence of the trading floor, echoing the silence of the factories shutting down across the nation. Workers are thrown into the streets, bread lines form in the cities, and the dream of eternal growth is replaced by the nightmare of starvation. Yet, in Cleveland, John D. Rockefeller watches the carnage with the calm detachment of a surgeon observing a necessary amputation. While others see disaster, he sees a cleansing, a divine intervention that punishes the reckless and rewards the disciplined. The weak must fall so the strong may rise, he muses, believing that competition is a sin and monopoly is the only path to order. With cash reserves hoarded like ammunition, Rockefeller enters the depressed market as a predator, buying out his bankrupt competitors for pennies on the dollar. He consolidates the oil industry with ruthless efficiency, transforming Standard Oil into the single greatest concentration of wealth in history. Would you have the stomach to profit from the ruin of your neighbors, telling yourself that you are saving the industry by killing its players? As the country bleeds, Cornelius Vanderbilt, the architect of the railroad age, reaches the end of his own line. The old lion lies in his bed, surrounded by the opulent trappings of an empire that is slowly slipping from his grasp. He leaves the world knowing he was the first titan, but also knowing he was beaten by the cold calculation of the new generation. His death marks the end of the era of the brawler, the time when physical strength and intimidation were enough to rule the world. He passes his crown to his son William, a capable man but one who lacks the raw, feral hunger that forged the Vanderbilt name. With Vanderbilt gone, The buffer between Rockefeller and total domination is removed, leaving only Tom Scott of the Pennsylvania Railroad to stand in his way. Scott is desperate, his railroad battered by the Depression and the loss of oil revenue, and desperation makes men dangerous. He realizes that he cannot beat Rockefeller at the transport game, so he decides to invade the enemy's territory directly. Scott announces plans to build his own pipeline, a direct assault on Standard Oil's monopoly, intending to control both the transport and the flow. It is an aggressive diversification strategy, similar to a modern search engine building its own hardware to cut out the device manufacturers. Rockefeller receives this news as a personal insult. He views the oil industry as his church, and Scott is a heretic defiling the altar. The cold specter decides that mere victory is no longer enough. He must destroy Tom Scott so completely that no one dares challenge him again. He issues an order to his refineries: shut it down, effectively blockading the Pennsylvania Railroad from receiving a single drop of kerosene. It is a scorched earth tactic, sacrificing his own short-term profits to bleed his enemy dry, a test of who can hold their breath the longest. Scott, already teetering on the brink of insolvency, cannot survive the loss of volume, and he is forced to slash wages to keep the trains running. But he forgets that a railroad is not just steel and timber. It is powered by men, and hungry men are combustible. The workers of the Pennsylvania Railroad, pushed to the breaking point, erupt in a violent rebellion that sets Pittsburgh ablaze. Riots consume the rail yards, buildings are torched, and locomotives are overturned as the rage of the proletariat boils over. Rockefeller watches from a distance as Scott's empire literally burns to the ground, destroyed by the very forces he tried to manipulate. It is the ultimate checkmate. Rockefeller didn't have to fire a shot, he simply applied pressure until the system destroyed itself. Tom Scott is broken, a shell of a man who dies shortly after, a casualty of a war he never truly understood how to fight. But from the ashes of Scott's failure, a new figure emerges, a young protege who watched the destruction of his mentor with wide, terrified eyes. Andrew Carnegie, the boy wonder of the railroads, stands amidst the ruins of Pittsburgh, internalizing a lesson that will shape the next century. He realizes that relying on others is a weakness, and to survive, one must control every aspect of the process, from the ground up. Carnegie looks at the burnt skeletons of the rail cars and sees not just destruction, but the material that will define the future: steel. Rockefeller has conquered the fluid world of oil, but Carnegie sets his sights on the solid world of construction, preparing to build the skeleton of America. The stage is cleared of the old actors. The pirate Vanderbilt and the gambler Scott are gone, leaving the disciplined monopolist to take the stage. Rockefeller now stands alone at the summit, the wealthiest man the world has ever seen, possessing a fortune that eclipses the treasury of the United States. But absolute power breeds absolute isolation, and the cold specter begins to realize that owning the world is a lonely endeavor. He is the most hated man in America, a symbol of corporate greed, yet he sleeps soundly, convinced he is doing God's work. The narrative shifts now from the horizontal expansion across the land to the vertical rise into the sky. The railroads connected the towns, oil lit the homes, but steel will allow the cities to stack humanity into the clouds. Andrew Carnegie knows that steel is the strongest material on Earth, but it is agonizingly slow and expensive to produce. If he can find a way to mass produce it, he will not just become rich, he will become the architect of the modern world. He travels to England, seeking a rumored technology that turns iron into steel in minutes rather than weeks. He finds the Bessemer process, a violently explosive method that blasts air through molten iron, a perfect metaphor for Carnegie's own volatile ambition. He returns to America with a vision that terrifies his investors: to build a massive steel plant in the middle of a recession. Put all your eggs in one basket, Carnegie famously declares, and then watch that basket. It is the gamble of the entrepreneur, betting against the current reality in favor of a future that only you can see. While Rockefeller tightens his grip on the existing economy, Carnegie prepares to build the infrastructure for a new one. The rivalry of the future will not be fought over tracks or pipes, but over the very structural integrity of the nation. As the 1,870 seconds close, America is no longer a collection of states. It is a corporate battleground ruled by kings without crowns. The government in Washington is a spectator, powerless to stop the titans who can crash the economy with a single decision. We see the formation of the oligarchy, where policy is dictated not by the ballot box, but by the boardroom table. Rockefeller, now secure in his fortress of oil, looks for new challenges, unaware that his legal and political battles are just beginning. Carnegie, standing on the muddy banks of the Monongahela River, breaks ground on the Edgar Thomson Works, the largest steel mill in the world. The noise of the future is deafening. The roar of the blast furnace, the hiss of the pipeline, the scream of the steam engine. But beneath the noise, there is a question that haunts every titan. What will be left of me when the fire goes out? For Vanderbilt, it was a statue. For Scott, a ruined reputation. For Rockefeller and Carnegie, the answer is yet to be written. They are the alchemists of the American dream, turning blood into gold and sweat into steel. But alchemy always demands a price, and the next chapter will demand payment in human lives. The workers, the fuel of this great engine, are beginning to organize, realizing that without them, the machine does not run. The friction between labor and capital is heating up, a spark waiting to land in a room full of dynamite. Carnegie wants to be loved, a fatal flaw for a man in the business of exploitation, creating a deep internal conflict. Rockefeller cares nothing for love, only for respect and order, making him a more perfect, albeit colder, machine. As we bridge to the next era, ask yourself, in the pursuit of greatness, is it better to be loved or feared? The history of business suggests that fear pays better dividends, but love builds longer-lasting monuments. The sun sets on the 1,870 seconds, a decade of fire and blood, giving way to the Gilded Age, where the surface is gold but the core is rotting. The men who built America have laid the foundation, but the walls will be built with the bones of the working class. Carnegie's steel will build the bridges that span the rivers. Rockefeller's oil once polluted. It is a closed loop of creation and destruction, a cycle that continues to spin in the boardrooms of Silicon Valley today. The players change, the technology evolves, but the game remains the same. Conquer or be conquered. Carnegie stands ready to cross his own Rubicon, preparing to build a bridge across the Mississippi that everyone says is impossible. It is the ultimate test of his new material, a project that will either bankrupt him or immortalize him. He needs a partner, a ruthless enforcer to handle the dirty work while he plays the benevolent philanthropist. Enter Henry Frick, the monster of the coke fields, a man who makes Vanderbilt look like a choir boy. But that is a story for the next chapter, as the focus shifts from the fluid power of oil to the rigid strength of steel. The camera pulls back from the smoking ruins of Pittsburgh, rising high above the soot and the struggle. We see the veins of the nation pulsing, the silver tracks, the black pipes, the glowing furnaces. It is a living organism, hungry and growing, demanding more resources, more land, more men. And at the controls, two men sit in silence, miles apart, plotting the next move in a game that has no end. The age of iron is over. The age of steel has begun. The Mississippi River stands as the great watery divide of the continent, a violent, mile-wide scar separating the East from the Wild West. Andrew Carnegie, possessed by a vision of unification, wagers his entire fortune on building the first bridge to span this treacherous expanse at St. Louis. It is the 19th century equivalent of the moon landing, an engineering impossibility that requires materials that do not yet exist in mass quantities. Standard iron is too brittle to withstand the river's crushing currents. The bridge demands steel, but steel is a luxury metal, rare and exorbitantly expensive. Carnegie is suffering from the innovator's dilemma. He has the solution to the problem, but the cost of the solution will bankrupt him before he begins. He pushes forward regardless, driving the construction of the Eads Bridge, a project that becomes a black hole consuming capital and hope in equal measure. As the massive steel arches rise, the public remains terrified, viewing the slender metal spans as a death trap waiting to collapse into the dark waters. Perception is the final barrier to innovation. It does not matter if the engineering is sound, if the user is too afraid to step onto the platform. To prove the bridge's strength, Carnegie orchestrates a brilliant piece of theater, exploiting a popular superstition that an elephant will never cross an unstable structure. A lone elephant, led by a confident trainer, steps onto the steel deck, leading a parade of skeptics across the divide in a moment of silenced awe. The bridge holds, and with it, the skepticism of a nation shatters. Carnegie has not just connected two banks, he has validated steel as the future of construction. Yet the victory is Pyrrhic. The bridge is a logistical triumph, but a financial disaster, leaving Carnegie drowning in debt and desperate for cash. He realizes that building one-off monuments is vanity. True wealth lies in mass adoption, in finding a customer who needs miles of steel, not just yards. He looks at the crumbling infrastructure of the railroads, where iron tracks are snapping under the weight of heavier locomotives and faster schedules. The pivot is executed with lethal precision. Carnegie retools his factories to produce steel rails, betting that the entire railroad industry must upgrade or die. It is the classic razor and blade strategy. He isn't just selling a commodity. He is selling the essential upgrade for the entire industrial ecosystem. The demand is insatiable. Steel rails last 20 times longer than iron, and soon Carnegie's steel is the spine of the American economy. With money flooding in, Carnegie faces the burden of scaling. He is a builder at heart, but the war for market share requires a destroyer. He desires to be seen as the benevolent patriarch, the good king, but his empire demands the ruthless suppression of labor and cost. This psychological fracture creates the need for a shadow self, an executive who can wield the whip while Carnegie waves the olive branch. Enter Henry Clay Frick, a man carved from the coal of Pennsylvania, possessing a heart as cold and hard as the coke he sells. Frick is the mercenary, a man who views business not as a service to humanity, but as a Darwinian struggle where the weak are fuel for the strong. He controls the supply of coke, the fuel necessary to fire Carnegie's blast furnaces, giving him leverage over the Steel King himself. Carnegie sees in Frick the brutality he lacks, and in a fateful decision, he brings the fox into the henhouse, making Frick his chairman. It is a partnership of opposites. Carnegie provides the vision and the capital. Frick provides the enforcement and the cruelty. Together, they double the profits of Carnegie's steel, squeezing efficiency out of the mills by squeezing the life out of the workers. We are not running a charity, Frick reminds the board, cutting wages and increasing hours, turning the mills into hellscapes of heat and exhaustion. The workers, once loyal to Carnegie, begin to see the true face of the company, and the rumble of discontent grows louder than the furnaces. But the Titans are too elevated to hear the screams from the valley. They are focused on building their own private paradise. High in the mountains above Johnstown, Pennsylvania, the elite members of the industrial aristocracy form the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. It is a playground for the gods, a secluded retreat where Carnegie, Frick, and their peers can escape the soot and grime they created. To create their private lake, they modify an old earthen dam, ignoring the warnings of engineers that the structure is fundamentally unsound. They lower the dam to widen the road for their carriages and install fish screens that clog the spillway, prioritizing their leisure over public safety. It is the ultimate display of hubris, altering the geography of the earth to suit a weekend hobby, blind to the physics of the water holding back. Below the dam lies the working-class town of Johnstown, a community of steel workers living in the shadow of the water that could drown them. Consider the modern parallel. This is the negligence of corporate pollution, where the risks are externalized to the poor while the profits remain privatized. Frick, indifferent to the danger, orders more modifications to the dam, treating the warnings as the whining of lesser men. The elements, however, do not respect bank accounts. A massive storm hits Pennsylvania, dumping inches of rain onto the saturated mountains. The water level in the private lake rises, pressing against the weakened earthen wall with the force of a trapped ocean. A telegram is sent to Johnstown. Dam is becoming dangerous and may possibly break, but the warning is ignored, lost in a history of false alarms. On the 31st of May, 1889, the laws of physics issue their verdict. The South Fork Dam collapses, unleashing 20 million tons of water. The wall of water, 40 feet high and carrying houses, trees, and locomotives, roars down the valley with the violence of an atomic bomb. It obliterates everything in its path, scrubbing the town of Johnstown from the map in a matter of minutes, leaving over 2,000 dead. The carnage is absolute. Bodies are buried under mountains of debris that catch fire, creating a hellish pyre of water and flame. It is the worst man-made disaster in American history prior to 9/11, a direct result of the negligence of the men who built the country. Carnegie is devastated. His carefully cultivated image of the benevolent philanthropist stained by the mud and blood of Johnstown. Frick, characteristically, is unmoved by the tragedy, focusing instead on the legal defense and ensuring the club members are not held liable. The public turns on the titans. The captains of industry are rebranded as robber barons, men who kill for profit and leisure. This is the turning point where the American public realizes that the unchecked power of the oligarchy is a threat to their very existence. Carnegie, racked with guilt, retreats to Scotland, leaving Frick in charge of the company during its most turbulent period. It is a cowardly abdication of leadership, leaving the wolf to guard the sheep while the shepherd hides in a castle across the ocean. At the Homestead Steel Works, the crown jewel of Carnegie's empire, the contract with the union is set to expire. Frick sees an opportunity not just to negotiate, but to break the union forever, asserting absolute control over the labor force. He begins fortifying the plant, building a wooden fence topped with barbed wire, turning the factory into a fortress known as Fort Frick. The message to the workers is clear. You are not partners in this enterprise. You are enemies at the gate. Frick slashes wages, daring the workers to strike, knowing that a conflict will give him the excuse he needs to bring in the militia. The workers at Homestead, proud men who built the steel that built America, refuse to back down, seizing control of the plant. It is an insurrection, a seizure of the means of production that terrifies the capitalist class across the nation. Frick does not call the police. He calls the Pinkertons, a private army of mercenaries known for their brutality and lack of accountability. Under the cover of darkness, 300 Pinkerton agents float down the river on barges, armed with Winchester rifles, preparing to retake the plant by force. The workers are waiting on the banks, armed with everything from hunting rifles to rocks, ready to die for their right to earn a living. When the barges land, a shot rings out, no one knows who fired first, and the Battle of Homestead begins. It is open warfare on American soil, a bloody skirmish between private capital and organized labor that leaves men dead on both sides. The Pinkertons are overwhelmed, beaten, and forced to surrender, a shocking defeat for the forces of the establishment. But the victory for the workers is fleeting. The state militia is called in, not to protect the people, but to protect the property of the corporation. Frick has won the physical battle, but he has lost the moral war. An anarchist attempts to assassinate him in his office. Shot in the neck and stabbed, Frick survives, refusing to leave his desk, displaying a terrifying resilience that cements his legend. "I do not think I shall die," he writes to Carnegie. "But whether I do or not, the company must pursue the same policy." Carnegie, reading the headlines in Scotland, is torn between his admiration for Frick's strength and his horror at the public relations nightmare. He realizes that he cannot be both the richest man in the world and the most loved. He must choose a path. The Homestead strike breaks the back of the union movement in the steel industry for 40 years, ensuring that profits will flow unimpeded. But the blood on the ground at Homestead stains the soul of Andrew Carnegie, driving him toward a new obsession: philanthropy. He begins to wonder if he can buy his way into heaven, distributing his fortune to build libraries and halls, putting his name on everything. Is it charity, or is it a desperate attempt to launder a reputation built on the exploitation of the men who died in his mills? While Carnegie wrestles with his conscience, a new challenger is rising in the world of finance. A man who deals not in steel or oil, but in money itself. J.P. Morgan sits in his office on Wall Street, watching the industrial chaos with the disdain of a patrician observing a bar fight. He is the titan of finance, a man with a nose so bulbous and eyes so piercing that people are afraid to meet his gaze. Morgan believes that competition is wasteful, a chaotic inefficiency that must be eliminated through the process of Morganization. He does not build companies. He buys them, merges them, and imposes order, extracting value through consolidation. He looks at the fractured electricity market, where a brilliant inventor named Thomas Edison is struggling to commercialize his light bulb. Morgan sees a future where electricity flows into every home, monitored by a meter that sends money directly to his bank account. It is the next great utility, the successor to oil, and Morgan wants to own the switch. But to own the future, he must back a horse. And Edison is a brilliant but erratic genius, prone to stubbornness. The stage is set for a war of currents, a technological battle between DC and AC that will decide how the world is powered. As the 19th century enters its twilight, the landscape has shifted. Rockefeller rules the fluids, Carnegie rules the solids, and Morgan rules the currency. These three men, uneasy peers, sit atop a pyramid of power that rivals the great monarchies of Europe. But there is friction at the top. Carnegie and Frick are drifting apart, their partnership poisoned by the blood of Homestead. Rockefeller is facing a government that is finally waking up to the danger of monopolies, wielding the Sherman Antitrust Act. And Morgan is preparing to make the biggest play of all, a move that will consolidate the entire economy under his personal direction. The question is no longer how much can you make, but how much is enough. For these men, the answer is always the same: a little bit more. We leave the smoky mills of Pittsburgh and head to the electrified streets of New York, where the final battle for the soul of capitalism will be fought. The lights are coming on, but the shadows are getting longer. Total 5 parts, starting part 4/5. Bakat cinquième. Block 1. Script. Thomas Edison is the wizard of Menlo Park, a man whose mind is a chaotic workshop of the future, churning out patents like a factory. But a wizard needs a patron, and J.P. Morgan is looking for magic that can be monetized on a global scale. Morgan invites Edison to his home, the first private residence in New York to be lit by electricity, a dazzling display of the new power. As the switch is flipped, the gas lamps dim, and the harsh, impossible brilliance of the incandescent bulb floods the room. Morgan sees instantly that this is not just a novelty. It is the death of the night, a product that extends the working day and the spending day. But for every action, there is a reaction. John D. Rockefeller watches the rise of electricity with the eyes of a man seeing his own funeral. Kerosene, the product that made him the richest man in history, is primarily used for light. If the bulb succeeds, the lamp is dead. Rockefeller launches a propaganda campaign, funding stories about the dangers of electricity, warning the public that the wires will burn down their homes. It is the innovator's dilemma played out in the press. The incumbent digging in his heels to stop the tide of progress. Despite the fear, the demand for light is overwhelming, and Morgan finances the construction of the Pearl Street station to power Lower Manhattan. But Edison has a fatal flaw. His system, direct current DC, is like a sprinter. It is powerful, but cannot travel long distances. To power a city with DC requires a power plant every single mile, a logistical impossibility that threatens to strangle the industry in its crib. Enter Nikola Tesla, a Serbian immigrant with the demeanor of a poet and the mind of a quantum physicist. Tesla works for Edison, digging ditches, but his mind is fixated on alternating current AC, a system that flows like a wave and can travel hundreds of miles. He presents the idea to Edison, the wizard, but Edison, blinded by ego and his investment in DC, dismisses Tesla as a dreamer. "You don't understand American humor," Edison sneers, cheating Tesla out of a promised bonus, a mistake that will cost him the future. Tesla quits, leaving the greatest inventor in the world to dig ditches again, until he is discovered by George Westinghouse. Westinghouse is the anti-Edison, a gentleman engineer who sees the value in Tesla's AC motor and buys the patents that Edison rejected. The war of currents begins, a technological holy war between the DC establishment and the AC insurgents. Consider the modern parallel. This is Apple's closed ecosystem versus Android's open platform, a battle for the operating system of the world. Edison, backed by Morgan, realizes that AC is technically superior, so he decides to destroy it psychologically. He begins a macabre campaign of fear marketing, paying children to bring him stray dogs and cats to his laboratory. In front of reporters, he electrocutes the animals using Westinghouse's AC generators, branding the rival technology as the executioner's current. It is a dark chapter in the history of innovation, where the drive to win overrides basic human decency. To deliver the final blow, Edison helps design the electric chair using AC power, hoping to associate Westinghouse's name with death. But the market is ruthless. It does not care about morality. It cares about efficiency, and AC is simply the better product. The deciding battleground is Niagara Falls, where a massive project is underway to harness the hydropower of the water to electrify the Northeast. It is the contract of the century, and the commission invites both General Electric, Edison, and Westinghouse to bid. Morgan, watching the numbers, realizes that Edison is lying to himself. DC cannot transmit power from Niagara to Buffalo, let alone New York City. In a rare moment of humility, the cold logic of finance overrides personal loyalty. Morgan knows he is backing the wrong horse. Westinghouse wins the contract, and the lights of the Buffalo World's Fair are powered by Tesla's generators, proving AC is the standard of the world. Edison is crushed, his ego shattered, but J.P. Morgan does not accept defeat. He simply changes the rules of the game. If he cannot win with technology, he will win with law and money, unleashing a barrage of patent lawsuits that threaten to bankrupt Westinghouse. Westinghouse, a man of honor, is backed into a corner, exhausted by the legal fees of fighting the richest man on Wall Street. He pleads with Tesla to tear up their royalty contract, which guarantees Tesla a fee for every horsepower of electricity generated. Tesla, in a moment of tragic nobility, tears up the contract to save Westinghouse's company, sacrificing billions of dollars to save his invention. It is the act of a pure creator, one who values the work over the reward, and it leaves him destined to die penniless. With Westinghouse weakened, Morgan makes his move, orchestrating a hostile consolidation of the electrical industry. He forces a merger between his own interests and his competitors, erasing Edison's name from the company he founded. Edison General Electric simply becomes General Electric, a corporate behemoth that controls the grid. Edison is marginalized, a king exiled from his own kingdom, learning the hard way that capital always trumps genius. J.P. Morgan now controls the electrical flow of the United States. But electricity needs something to power. He turns his gaze back to the physical world, to the steel that builds the skyscrapers now rising in Manhattan. The economy is recovering, and the fragmentation of the steel industry offends Morgan's sense of order. He sees Carnegie, now an old man, looking to secure his legacy and perhaps exit the bloody game he has won. Carnegie is the king of steel, but he is tired, haunted by Johnstown and Homestead, and yearning to spend his final years giving away his money. Morgan knows that Carnegie is the only man who can stop his plan for total consolidation, so he must buy him out. But how do you buy a man who has more money than God? You don't make an offer, you ask him to name his price. Morgan sends his lieutenant, Charles Schwab, to a dinner party to plant the seed in Carnegie's mind. Schwab paints a picture of a super trust, a single company that owns every phase of steel production, bringing stability to the world. Carnegie listens, the entrepreneur in him intrigued by the scale, the tired old man in him tempted by the exit. The next day, Carnegie scribbles a number on a scrap of paper, $480 million. It is an astronomical sum, equivalent to the entire budget of the U.S. federal government, a number so large it feels imaginary. Schwab delivers the paper to Morgan, who glances at it once and says simply, "I accept." The deal is done in seconds, the largest financial transaction in human history, transferring the industrial power of America from the builder to the banker. Morgan shakes Carnegie's hand and says, "Congratulations, Mr. Carnegie. You are now the richest man in the world." U.S. Steel is born, the first billion-dollar corporation, a monopoly so vast it effectively owns the infrastructure of the nation. But this concentration of power does not go unnoticed. A new force is rising in American politics, one that does not fear money. The public is angry, tired of the robber barons who treat the country as their private chessboard. A brash young politician named Theodore Roosevelt is making noise, railing against the malefactors of great wealth. The Titans dismiss him as a noisy nuisance, a cowboy who doesn't understand how the real world works. They engineer a plan to bury him in the vice presidency, a powerless role where careers go to die, to keep him out of the governor's mansion. It is a strategic error of catastrophic proportions, proving that even the smartest men can be blinded by their own arrogance. Fate, the unseen character in our story, intervenes once again in September 1901. President William McKinley, a friend of the monopolies, is assassinated by an anarchist in Buffalo, near the very power plant that changed the world. The Titans receive the news with horror. The cowboy they tried to silence is now the President of the United States. Roosevelt enters the White House not as a puppet, but as a trustbuster, wielding the power of the federal government like a big stick. He looks at the empires of Rockefeller, Morgan, and Carnegie not as achievements, but as threats to democracy itself. "We must draw the line against misconduct," Roosevelt thunders, "not against wealth, but against the abuse of wealth." He files suit against J.P. Morgan's Railroad Trust, Northern Securities, shocking Wall Street by attacking the untouchable king of finance. Morgan travels to Washington, treating the president like a junior partner, offering to fix the problem man to man. "If we have done anything wrong," Morgan says, "send your man to my man and they can fix it up." Roosevelt refuses, signaling the end of the era where the boardroom dictated terms to the Oval Office. The Supreme Court rules against Morgan, breaking up the trust, the first domino to fall in the dismantling of the monopolies. But the biggest target remains: Standard Oil, the octopus that controls 90% of the oil in America. Rockefeller, now retired and obsessed with golf, is dragged back into the spotlight to defend the empire he built. He takes the stand in court, claiming he doesn't remember the ruthless tactics that crushed his competitors. But the evidence is overwhelming. A paper trail of secret deals and intimidation that exposes the dark heart of the Gilded Age. The court orders the breakup of Standard Oil into 34 smaller companies, an act intended to punish Rockefeller. But in a final twist of irony, the breakup makes Rockefeller even richer. As the individual stocks of the new companies, Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, soar on the open market, Rockefeller's net worth triples. He becomes the first man in history to be worth $1 billion, proving that you can break the company, but you cannot break the equity. The era of the Titans ends not with a bang, but with a transformation. They leave the battlefield of business to enter the pantheon of philanthropy. Rockefeller and Carnegie spend their final years in a competition of giving, racing, to see who can give away more money before they die. It is the final act of the ego. If I cannot rule the earth forever, I will buy immortality through my name on every library and university. But a new invention is on the horizon, one that will utilize Rockefeller's gasoline and Carnegie's steel to change the world again. A mechanic in Detroit named Henry Ford is tinkering with an engine, dreaming of a car for the common man. The Titans built the infrastructure, but Ford will build the freedom to move through it. The baton is passed from the monopolist to the consumerist, from the few to the many. As we look back at the 19th century, we see a landscape scarred by greed but built by greatness. They were the men who built America. Distinct from the men who merely lived in it, they did the things that others said were impossible, and in doing so, they dragged a reluctant nation into the future. Their legacy is complex. We drive on their roads, burn their fuel, and live in their cities, while debating the morality of their methods. The final question they leave us is this: is progress possible without a few monsters to lead the way? The train whistle fades, the smoke clears, and the modern world begins. Henry Ford arrives not as a king, but as a mechanic, representing the final evolution of the American entrepreneur. While Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, and Carnegie built the vertical pillars of the nation, Ford seeks to build the horizontal freedom to move between them. But the old guard does not yield power gracefully. A cartel known as the Association of Licensed Automobile Manufacturers claims ownership of the very idea of the car. They are the patent trolls of the early 20th century, a group of elites who demand a royalty for every vehicle built, stifling innovation to protect their profits. They deny Ford a license, viewing his dream of an affordable car for the masses as a threat to their luxury market dominance. The car is a toy for the rich, they sneer, echoing the skepticism that greeted the railroad and the light bulb. Ford, possessed by the same defiance that drove Rockefeller to build the pipeline, decides to build his car anyway, daring them to sue him. "Tell them I will build it," Ford declares, "and I will sell it to anyone who has the cash." The lawsuit is filed, a David versus Goliath legal battle that threatens to crush Ford Motor Company before it can truly begin. While the lawyers fight in the courtroom, Ford fights on the factory floor, obsessed with a singular problem: efficiency. He observes the meatpacking plants of Chicago, where cows are disassembled on moving hooks, and asks the reverse question: if they can disassemble a cow on a moving line, why can't we assemble a car on one? The assembly line is born, the final piece of the industrial puzzle, reducing the time to build a car from 12 hours to 90 minutes. It is the democratization of luxury. By mass-producing the Model T, Ford drives the price down from $900 to $260. Suddenly, the steel Carnegie smelted and the gasoline Rockefeller refined are accessible to the common teacher, farmer, and factory worker. But Ford realizes that mass production requires mass consumption. People need money to buy the products they build. In a move that shocks the capitalist world, he introduces the $5 workday, doubling the average wage of his workers. The Titans criticize him as a socialist, But Ford knows he is the ultimate capitalist. He is creating his own customers. He wins the lawsuit against ALAM, breaking the cartel and opening the roads to a new era of unbridled competition. The age of the monopoly ends, and the age of the consumer begins, fueled by the infrastructure laid by the giants who came before. As the 20th century roars to life, the titans begin to fade into history, their mortality catching up to their monuments. J.P. Morgan dies in Rome, the city of emperors, leaving behind a financial system that still rules the world. Andrew Carnegie passes away, having given away 90% of his fortune. His name etched on 2,500 libraries that educate the masses. John D. Rockefeller outlives them all, watching the world change from horse-drawn carriages to airplanes, dying at 97 as the architect of modern energy. Their physical bodies decay, but their DNA is woven into the very fabric of the American superpower. Look at the skyline of New York. Rockefeller Center stands as a beacon of commerce. The Empire State Building rises on Carnegie's steel. Look at the map. The highways that crisscross the nation follow the paths of Vanderbilt's rails. But their true legacy is not in stone or steel. It is in the archetype of the disruptor that they created. We see their faces mirrored in the leaders of today. The ruthlessness of Bezos, the vision of Musk, the dominance of Gates. The cycle repeats. A new technology emerges. A visionary seizes it. A monopoly is formed, and the government steps in to break it. Vanderbilt's blockade of the bridge is today's deplatforming. Rockefeller's rebates are today's algorithmic biases. The medium changes from oil to data, from rails to fiber optics, but the ruthless physics of power remain the same. We stand on the shoulders of giants, but we must remember that giants are often monsters to those who stand in their way. They were men who saw the world not as it was, but as it could be, and had the sheer force of will to bend reality to their vision. They taught us that the American dream is not given, it is taken, carved out of the wilderness with grit, blood, and a total disregard for the status quo. As we navigate the chaos of our own digital revolution, we must ask ourselves the questions they answered with their lives. Do you have the courage to bet everything when the world says you are wrong? Do you have the strength to be hated in exchange for being effective? And when you reach the top of the mountain, will you build a wall to keep others out or a ladder to help them up? The story of the men who built America is not a history lesson. It is a user manual for the ambitious. It reminds us that chaos is just a ladder and crisis is just an opportunity wearing a terrifying mask. The fog that covered the nation in 1865 has lifted, revealing a landscape of skyscrapers, highways, and networks. But somewhere, in a garage or a dorm room, a new whistle is blowing, signaling the arrival of the next Vanderbilt, the next Rockefeller. The train is leaving the station again. The tracks are laid for those who dare to drive the engine. Success is not a destination, but the ability to see the roads that everyone else insists do not exist.